Greetings and salutations. My name is Kyrie Davis Towns. I'm a graduating senior philosophy major from Morehouse College. Today I'll be presenting my senior final project in Africana 336 studies class, the Gullah Geechee experience. Um, I'd like to start off by speaking on my interdisciplinary approach as a philosopher, looking to connect history, social action, and activism, and cultural formation and preservation. Uh, what I'll be talking about today is the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, a federally approved and recognized cultural corridor that's based in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and North Florida amongst the coastal areas. My biggest points that I'm going to be trying to make today are an argument in favor of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor and becoming the modern capital of African American, Pan-African, and Pan-nationalism. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you can understand better not only how confident I am that this can be a true thing in the future for Pan-Africanists within the diaspora, but also the endless possibilities that can come from Pan-Africanists and African diasporic peoples, recentering the Low Country as a physical place for Pan-African views, African ethics and cultures to be properly explored and supported and preserved in the Western Hemisphere for diasporic people. So first, let's get into how Gullah Geechee connects. Who are the Gullah Geechee people? How their culture connects with African ethics, how their culture connects with African culture, how their culture has preserved itself in distinction from not being a creolized culture and being able to say, 400 years post the capture and improper human trafficking of African people, they were able to keep a culture that is still very much similar and not too variant from the coastal African cultures that they were removed from, that they were taken from, that they were told that they were supposed to forget about, that the world was told that they forgot about, but they clearly have not. It's still very present in the everyday Gullah Geechee culture down in the Low Country. I would also like to talk about the other connections that come with Gullah. First, we have to look at scholars from an interdisciplinary approach, historians such as Sterling Stuckey, Michael Gomez, cultural anthropologists of the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and Zora Neale Hurston, who are also Gullah peoples. And all of this work towards identifying and understanding Black culture, Black historical preservation, reworking the definitions of our history, is all positive work and all in light of the history and culture of perseverance and social change and African ethics of humanity, of Ubuntu and I am because we are, that is kind of seen in community in the Low Country. And this is not a tie to anything they learned from European peoples, but a tie to the collective culture that these several groups of West African people already had, this base of African ethics that centered around community, that centered around traditional oratorical traditions and spiritual traditions. Although they were distinctly different back in the continent, here in America, through the isolation of the Low Country, through the distinct isolation of enslavement, they were able to keep a variation of those stories and histories and practices that they knew and cultivated in Africa, but use them in a way that helped them in their new Western hemispherical life. Everything isn't completely African, but to a great extent, the core values that keep Gullah African, that keep Gullah connected to the African roots, are directly connected to West African and coastal African cultures. This can be resembled in the food, in spiritual practices, in language. Sterling Stuckey does his best of distinguishing the distinction of Gullah culture when he's responding to writers such as Mintz and Price, who tried to say that Gullah was a form of cultural creolization in America. Uh, that creolization could be understood mainly as while slaves were being distributed and dispersed as basically human trafficking capital, the argument can be made that the things and cultures that they were used to, the cultural institutions of religion, of education, of health, of work, were all destroyed and were replaced by European-centered ideals of these things, mainly to put Africans in the mindset of an enslaved mindset, in a dehumanized mindset. From that, people would like to say, Mintz and Price would like to say that all variations of Black or African-esque culture in the Western Hemisphere is not a true connection to African cultures and ethics, but a connection to European-centric ethics and cultures that are simply being practiced in a divergent, creolized manner. Sterling Stuckey completely rebuttals this and explains that what came with the isolation and distinction of all of these West African and coastal African people being together in this space came a kind of melting pot, a distinct melting pot, not a forgetting of certain cultural beliefs, but getting to the core of those beliefs, getting to the core of how those beliefs connect and are still useful for those African people when they traveled through the Great Passage. Through Sterling Stuckey's definition, by making Gullah a distinct African subculture and not a creolized culture, the Gullah Geechee corridor remains a direct cultural connection to African culture. This is important because if the Low Country, if the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, cultural corridor, is going to be a physical place of Pan-Africanism in the 21st century, it needs to have some type of connection to African ethics before African diasporic people with the beliefs of Pan-Africanism come to the Low Country and try and change anything or influence African and Pan-African thoughts on the Low Country. It's already clear due to the work of Sterling Stuckey that there's already African ethics and African culture existing in the Low Country, preserved in the Low Country through the isolation that came from their travel and combined experience of enslavement. To touch on Michael Gomez's historical interpretation from Exchanging Our Country Marks, he explores and contextualizes the creation of Gullah Geechee identity in the Low Country by preserving slave records, and can kind of reject the creolization culture of Gullah culture by looking at the direct numbers of who came from where, how many of them came, where they stayed, where they formatted, and then taking another look at what were the cultures like in many of the coastal African and Central African regions that enslaved peoples that came to the Americas came from. Some of these spaces, high majority of Gullah people and their ancestry can be tapped back to the Congo, Angola, Sierra Leone, and Senegambia, and many other countries and small tribal areas around that space. You had the Wolof people, the Ashanti, the Fanti people, and their culture is present in Gullah culture. It is not the distinct culture. One culture does not lead the way over another, even though some people assume that and kind of guess that Gullah is somewhat of a variation of Angolan, or kind of like an Angola word for people. But Gomez and the work of Sterling Stuckey show that the distinction of Gullah culture is a direct correlation to sub-African culture that was ripped from the African continent. Through the isolation of the Low Country, Sterling Stuckey is able to show that these people brought a culture with them. That culture stayed with them. They preserved that culture. They passed it on to their children. They formulated and evolved that culture to make sense in the new space that they were in. And Michael Gomez does a great job of connecting the dots of Congolese, Angolan, Sierra Leonean, and Senegambian cultures of that are very resemblant to the coastal lifestyle that the Gullah people are used to in America. The traditions and spiritual practices that they practice, the Gullah people in America, are very resemblant of the distinct cultures that are all tied to the formation of the Gullah people in America. So I think looking at this historical contextualization, we can start to see better how Gullah connects not only to African American identity, but to African culture and ethics as just a extension to the modern diaspora. Here in America, Gullah is our connection to African culture. Gullah is our connection to Caribbean culture. Gullah is our ability to show that our people were not completely demoralized and dehumanized and forgot about the stories and memories of their homeland. We never forgot, and Gullah is proof of that. One of the main leaders of the Gullah Geechee movement and the formation identity of Gullah people and African American people in America is a man by the name of Denmark Vesey. He was a spiritual leader as well as a revolutionary during his time. Gomez explains Denmark Vesey's challenge kind of as a metaphor for the larger challenge that came with the coastal West African people that were enslaved in the Low Country and in America. Of course, before these people got to America, they were somewhat aware of each other or rivals or all out, competitors or friends in the continental Africa. Many of their languages kind of were similar. Their cultures were similar, yet their distinct day-to-day life were not similar. They were proudly distinct. This all changed in America with the capturing of all of these cultural people on purpose. These European people captured these people because they had specific skills. These people were skilled workers with skilled knowledge, but they also captured them knowing what would come from gathering people of different languages, of different cultures, some of them even being rivals in a foreign land. Many African Americans formed their African American identity through the formation of this Gullah Geechee identity. And the Gullah Geechee identity was formed through Vesey's challenge. Denmark Vesey, born in St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, moved and came to America from enslavement. He was inspired by the Haitian Revolution. He looked at the Haitian Revolution not only as a spiritual but physical place of African liberation. He wanted to connect the dots of the Gullah people in the Low Country before they knew they were Gullah, so that they could galvanize, riot, and return to Saint Domingue, Haiti, and connect with people of African descent, of liberation mindsets, and destroy the oppressive system that they had amongst themselves. The plan was very intricate. He did a great job of planning it, of connecting across the Low Country. Unfortunately, his plan was uncovered. Him and everyone else that occupied in his plan were murdered before the plan could be put into proper action and receive proper fruit. But Michael Gomez does a great job of distinguishing that this is a key factor and moment in the history of Gullah identity formation. Denmark Vesey is a cultural leader in Gullah Geechee history. He has a statue in Charleston dedicated to his movement and his legacy. And to this day, Gullah people hold him as a leader and as one of the key factors of their formation from groups of coastal African people, mainly transported and trapped and losing culture in the Americas, to all of these cultural peoples accepting where they are, challenging this ideal of Blackness that has already grouped them all together because they're from the same continent, and use that to create a new culture, a culture that preserves all of their African ethnicities, ethics and cultures of community, of living off the land, of social change and perseverance. Denmark Vesey is the perfect example of where that African and Gullah identity begins to transform. And he's also a connection to the African identity African American identity and Caribbean identity and the connection that we have in social change and resistance here in Americas once our ancestors were dispersed here. I would go on to say that people such as Walter Rodney, it went a little bit early, but connecting back to the diaspora, this is all important because it is said that 75 to 85% of African Americans today can track their lineage back to Gullah people in the Low Country. Of course, this is because mainly all African Americans ancestors came through the Igbo landing in the coastal Carolina slave entrances. Modern African Americans do not know much of the Gullah experience. If they knew more of the Gullah experience, which I think this research has showed me needs to be more present, we could connect more people to the Gullah experience. African Americans take up at least 47% of the population in the United States. The Gullah Geechee corridor, as of updated of 2021, is made up of 1 million Gullah people, aka African American people. This is a large disparity in people who are actually recognized as Gullah and African Americans who clearly have Gullah ancestry. Some people may not be able to fully say like, oh, I'm living that low country rural life, but for sure, many, if not all African Americans can say, I do have Angolan roots. I do have Congolese roots. I do have Senegambian roots. And Gullah is their connection to how those roots got to America and how those roots were preserved in America. Now let's get on to other leaders. I feel that Walter Rodney is a great Pan-African activist and leader who was taken too soon, but it's almost like the Denmark VC of today's challenge. He saw in his lifetime that the children of tomorrow, that's what he called them, the oppressors' children and the oppressed children were having unique conversations that their parents could not understand or could not control. I feel that now, after doing the research of this paper, that he was speaking of my generation, a generation that was born kind of intermingling with oppressive children and oppressed children. And we're all having a better idea of what liberation really looks like, of what equality really looks like, and changing and trying to restructure historical cultural views. Pan-Africanism is the perfect place to put those views into some type of fluidity, not just for African people, but for all minority peoples in America. The current white structure is patriarchal. Pan-Africanism basically asks to sit on African ethics of humanity, such as Ubuntu, Sankofa, reaching back and restoring, and a lot of community and social change and the heart of perseverance. Sometimes it's hard to put a tone on the culture that has been created through the resistance of the narrative of slavery in all of the independent spaces in the Western Hemisphere. But I think through a Pan-Africanist view, all of our Africana diasporic peoples can connect under this larger theory and history of perseverance and social change. America and African Americans have, of course, spearheaded what that looks like in the modern age. The first ever revolution and most successful revolution, slave revolution by African Americans, is the Haitian Revolution. But the most transformative global social change and revolution has come by the hands and culture of African Americans through the use of the American democratic system, elevating from enslaved to free, from Jim Crow to fully free, all the way to the point where we've reached a Black president and a post-Black president America, by the use of and information of historians such as Sterling Stuckey and Michael Gomez, but also the modern work of Pan-Africanists and scholars such as Walter Rodney. We can use the tactics and see the contextualization that if Denmark VC's challenge was to connect coastal African American identities, coastal African identities in America so that they can become African American, Walter Rodney's challenge, I'm suggesting, is to connect Africana diasporic peoples across the Western Hemisphere to be Pan-Africanists. And although Walter Rodney died in an early untimely fashion, which is very questionable of the role that the government played in his death because of the things that he was saying of Pan-Africanism and his critiques on capitalism. He has left a groundwork for us to understand what the European civilization has done to Africa and actively underdeveloping it while they develop themselves. This is why we see the extreme disparities in education, in economics, in finance, in institution and infrastructure amongst African countries and cultures and European countries and cultures in the West, as well as in the continent of Africa. One of Rodney's main beliefs that I think connects to my presentation is that he believed that capitalism could be destroyed by a working class of African people galvanized behind the principles of socialism. Now, a part of me doing my research and why I believe the Low Country can be a capital, a physical capital of Pan-Africanism and Pan-nationalism in the modern era is that there's research that shows that in America, earlier when I said 75 to 85% of African Americans can tie their roots back to Gullah Geechee heritage, cultural heritage corridor, is because Caribbean peoples are considered all Black, all African when they move to America, regardless of the language that they speak, regardless of the culture that they may come from. Here they are all Black. So that number of Gullah people who can connect, African Americans who can connect directly to Gullah people, aka like historically African Americans, like people who have been here since the Igbo landing and the continued human trafficking of their ancestors, are not very aware that they have this connection to Gullah people in a direct link to African American culture. The Caribbean people, on the other hand, Haitian people, people from the Bahamas, people from Barbados, Jamaica, they have a lot more distinct and more recent African identifier because they have African-centered countries. But many of these countries aren't centered in African ethics, yet they come to America and become African and become Black and don't really accept what that means here in America, not understanding that that's what it means for all Africans in the Western Hemisphere. Here we are all Black. On one hand, this is limiting, but on another hand, if we can look at it and center ourselves in African ethics, it is of value. Separately, we are two divided nations of 40 million African Americans spread throughout America and 40 million plus Africans spread throughout the Caribbean. If these two numbers can come together, we rank somewhere around 80 to 88 million people, African Americans, across 20 plus distinct nations, cultures, and languages. That's over the size of England. Caribbean people are already coming to America and slowly rejecting what comes with African American identity and Black identity in America because of all of the negative incantations that come with it. And they use America as a platform to uplift economically, culturally, and like educationally, the islands that they come from. This is pan-nationalism. The remnants that they pay when they come to America and they want to have a great job, but send money back to their family, send money back to their parents, send money back to the school that they helped, send money back to the job that they grew up having, but now they live in America. This is all a part of a larger pan-nationalist view. If the African Americans and Caribbean Americans can see their identity as one, not just this larger African, like of course we're all African, but truly see that Gullah Geechee culture has federally been shown and approved as a direct link to African Americans having a culture that is distinct from European culture in the Americas. It exists here in Africa. We have every opportunity to connect Africans, Caribbeans, and African Americans in a democratic space that would allow for a growing population of people who think the same politically, economically, to almost change the face of a state or a political process here in America. Isolated, we are easily divided and manipulated here in America. We're outnumbered. But together, we could use the sway that comes from our intercontinental connections and international connections to create a movement here in America based in African ethics that all ethnic minority groups can get behind, because it's still about uh, uh, social change. It's still about preservation um, of indigenous and unique cultures, and it's about equality. Right now, we're seeing a large uplift in like the activism and active conversations that go into African American activism in America. More white people are participating, more Hispanics are participating, more Asian people are participating. The LGBTQ plus community has used a lot of the tactics that came from the civil rights movement to progress and move their um, movement along in the face of hate and homophobia and transphobia. Um, a Pan-African movement could sync with the young generation today. The young generation that is basically more ethnic than it has ever been in America. Ethnic groups are going to be one-to-one with white Americans in Gen Z as they develop and grow, as they become, doctors and judges and lawyers. We have a better chance of seeing a community that is a quarter African American. All of that is including, Caribbean Americans. Unfortunately, they put all Black people together. So Nigerians, historical African Americans, Caribbean Americans, Afro Latinos, Latinos Americans, Asian Americans, and white Americans. We will all be splitting up basically the country in fourths, unlike in the past where it was white people were majority by 2/3 or by 3/4. A Pan-African movement based in African ethics can use the momentum that African Americans have created in America of a history of social change, a history of equality, a history of connecting the dots of how people can go from oppressed to happy and liberated. I think now is the best time. Gen Z is young, we're active. If we can connect the dots and do more research about the connections between the Caribbean and the Gullah corridor, if we can do more research on the true demographics and ethics of the Caribbean and the African American community, if we can connect that 75% of African Americans who just don't know that they are of Gullah descent and what it means to be of Gullah descent and the distinction that comes from being a sub-African isolated culture and not some creolized culture in America, we could see a true change in what I think could be the physical capital of Pan-Africanism. South Carolina has a population of, South Carolina has a population of around 5 million, over 5 million. 3.5 million of these people are white, leaving the cultural corridor to be basically scattered amongst 3 states and protected by a minority of a minority of a minority. 1 million Gullah people are what stay in the cultural corridor. But that's not enough for Pan-Africanism to become that's not enough for the Low Country to become the Pan-African capital. I think that at the next African Pan-African Congress, if a proposal can be put together to identify the connections with Caribbean culture and African American culture in the Low Country, the coastal lifestyle that comes with the Low Country, how they have relations in coastal African countries and Caribbean countries, we can put together a plan within the next 5 to 10 years that can slowly start to migrate and move not just African Americans, but Caribbean Americans and Pan-Africanists across the diaspora to the Low Country. Using the democratic American political system in our favor, in short time, we can outnumber and match the white population in South Carolina. Through matching that population in South Carolina, we can start to codify laws and uh uh institutions that support our Pan-African and African cultures and ethics. I think this is definitely a big ask. I understand, like, during my research, that a lot still needs to be done academically to tie all these things together. A lot still needs to be done socially to tie all these things together. But I think this was the perfect time for me as a philosopher to look at this, me as a young Black man to look at this, and see that the hard work of our ancestors, um, in the face of dehumanization, in the face of enslavement, um, was not lost. You know, the hope that they had in the face of despair was not ignorant. It all led to where we are today. It all led to the possibilities that Black would no longer be this big blanket that all African diasporic people would just have to accept and define and struggle with. But now we can use it to our advantage to actualize a Pan-African and pan-nationalist movement in a real way, in a tangible way, using democratic policies, using the country that's leading in immigration and in the thriving of Caribbean peoples, and recognizing that in the data that I researched, that Caribbean peoples are some of the hardest working class people in America. They make up a large portion of working class African Americans, and if Walter Rodney uh, claimed that capitalism cannot be destroyed without working class, uh, Afro-centered minded African people, or people, Pan-African people, uh, it can be actualized. That idea of working class or people around centered around African ethics can be actualized in the Low Country, where African ethics and history and culture has been duly preserved, upheld, and federally recognized. Just a plan has to be put together that connects those dots, that connects all of our cultural heritage and reblends ourselves from being African American and uh, Jamaican and Haitian, and just coming back to understanding that those are just places, but we are people, and we are people of African descent. And what it means for us to be here is that we were forced here, but what it means for us to stay here is to make this place better and to make this place home and to not forget about where we came from and the things that got us to this point. That's perfect. That's perfectly personified in the Low Country, and I think that across the diaspora, with the right principles, uh, all peoples within the diaspora, Caribbean, African American, Afro Latino, and true descent and true like African peoples can see the Low Country as a physical place for them to come and live out their Pan-African realities. Uh, a thing that I haven't seen done yet in my lifetime, but I hope that I can be a part of. I hope that this is just the beginning of the work. I hope that you learned something from this. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I plan to do more research on the connections between the African American population and the Gullah population, and how we can close that gap and get more African Americans to identify as Gullah, and then furthering the connection and barriers between an African American identity and a Caribbean identity, seeing that we all have the same ancestry. It was a pleasure. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.